There you go.
Perfect. Yeah, that's helpful. So I did want to just chat about some of the color updates because I know that you had done significant work on this before, and
Right.
I think I referenced your blog post in one of these. But uh, anyway, I'll go ahead and share my screen here.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. You see that all right?
Yep. Yep.
Perfect. Yeah, so I wanted to get your feedback on two items primarily, and then the third, if we have time. I want to be respectful of your time too, so I'll try to make it quick, and then you can kind of think on things offline as well.
Mm-hmm.
So the first is just updates to our primary color palette
Mm-hmm.
uh, for like considering normalization and accessibility. So they kind of go together in the sense that my overall goal would be to normalize the palette so that the 500 value of each of our hues always has like a similar contrast ratio against like different surfaces that we're using, like
Mm-hmm.
if it's white or FA, or our darkest gray,
Mm-hmm.
950. So in that regard, you could always say like, hey, use this button, and when you're designing, you would always know, okay, the fill is always going to be the 500. The border can be one or two steps above that. You can normalize that for hover states, for focus, where you're always saying, okay, the base is the 500, the hover states the 700, whatever it might be, and that way you can have some rules that normalize that across the board. So even when
Mm-hmm.
we're using icons, we don't have to change it up per color to
Mm-hmm.
try to align that. Everything is kind of synonymous, so it kind of normalizes it in that sense. So that's goal number one. And then goal number two would be to make sure that like all of those 500 values pass at a certain contrast ratio. So meeting the 451 for like our type and UI elements. I'll get into like the data viz, which is like a 3.1
Mm-hmm.
or 3-to-1 ratio for those. So so with that, let's see here. It's kind of a high level, so everything's here in the solution.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I post the video, I'll link to these issues as well, so that they're
Sure.
in there. So I'll just run through. So palette update, there's some
Mm-hmm.
comparisons in here. This is some initial exploration, but basically just showing how
Mm-hmm.
uh, the range changes a little bit. It's a little more of a linear easing to it.
Mm-hmm.
That way the darkness or the passing can happen at 500,
Mm-hmm.
and we have a little more room on either end to kind of go out from there. So starting with that middle, currently it goes from very light to very dark, and it tends to have a little more of a curve towards the darker values where
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of light, and then it ramps up to dark a little more exponentially. So just making that a little more linear across the board. The scope of this was not only our primary UI palette, but also
Mm-hmm.
themes and neutrals. And I'll jump over to Figma here in a second to go through that.
Mm-hmm.
I did also consider purple. Uh, there's some use cases that I won't go through here, but that have come up with other UI elements. And since it's part of our brand and we're incorporating that, I
Mm-hmm.
think we could use that, but also include it as another layer for some of the UI where we're doing states or status, so that
Mm-hmm.
we can assign a meaning to it similarly to how the other colors in our UI have meaning. So
Right.
I wanted to keep that in there as well. Another piece of this was also considering surfaces. So uh, oftentimes you'll see like, okay, contrast ratio on white, but
Mm-hmm.
then you go and use that color on a different surface, and it's like, well, all of a sudden, like that's enough of a difference where it no longer passes.
Correct.
Excuse me. Since we're using a lot on the current gray 50, the FA, I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to set that as our baseline for meeting the 451 contrast.
Mm-hmm.
And then conversely, on the dark side, using our darkest gray 950, the 1F, 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 1F as the darkest value, so that way it actually makes the outcome a little more robust. So we know it's always going to work
Right.
on white. It's always going to work on these two common
Mm-hmm.
surfaces. And so that was one of the kind of the key factors in thinking through that.
Mm-hmm.
And then normalizing contrast ratios. So I mentioned that, but I have a little table here,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
I'll get into that where we have like our different surfaces.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll jump into Figma really quick here, and just show what I've got. So in Figma, in our globals beta, I've got a color page here, and this I labeled this as colors beta for now. And what I've done is outline UI, neutrals, themes, and
Mm-hmm.
data viz, and then transparencies all in one. You'll notice these values, they are the contrast ratio given both the dark and light surface.
Right.
So, what that might be. So you can see how they're somewhat, normalized 451, 451. They're all like in that ballpark, which
Mm-hmm.
provides that normalization. Just a
Yeah,
little caveat.
they're at least 451. That's the right.
Yes. Yep. And so I put the background in here, the surface, just so you
Mm-hmm.
know, like, okay, these are all going to be 451 on this surface. From
Mm,
here over is all 451 on this surface.
that's great.
And you can see how it's kind of normalized through the themes. Data viz takes a little different just because the requirements are different. So a 3-to-1 contrast ratio for UI elements.
Mm-hmm.
And so applied that accordingly.
Yeah, we
So
can be a bit more vibrant, right?
exactly. And with that, I've also made data viz, and I'll jump into that a little bit, but data viz where the 500 values go either or, right? There's the middle 500 value is 3-1 on either surface. And the reason for that is then, since we have 11 steps in each hue, when you do like light or dark, you have 6 steps to use for light or dark, rather than like 5 on one and 6 on another. So having those middle values go either way, I think helps with that. In Figma, really quick, like I have a ColorChip kind of base symbol where you can easily turn on and off those ratios so that you can view these. So I'm just going to turn them off for now, just to look at these hues a little better. And then I'm also going to open up a utility here. I'll just hide it for now, but it's SimDalton.
It's showing perfectly on the screen share.
Okay, great. And so I'll use that here in a second. So just focusing on UI at the moment, my goal is really to normalize these values and ensure that what we ended up with, works across each hue. And so I did that at first by really anchoring kind of on that 500 value and using a few different tools to just, span the gap as far as reaching that. I think, let me just see if I can refer to one of these tools really quick here, if I've got it. I'll just pull up, let's see. Boy, I don't want to spend too much time looking for this, but if I have it, I've got a lot of different options. Which one was I using here? All right, well, I will skip that for now. But basically, there's lots of different tools to create a color palette.
Yeah.
I used one as like a...
Too many, I guess.
I used one as a guide, and that would help me create the proper steps for making more of a linear transition so that it's normalized. And at the end of the day, just making sure that they're equal and not having too much of a curve either end. So a little more linear steps rather than exponential. One of the key, I'll just jump in really quick on this. Orange is like notoriously hard to get contrast ratio just because of its scale. So that's one of the areas where it's close, and we'll have to rely a lot on context to help differentiate some of that. And I think I've got, you can see here in some of the exploration where, a large scale, it's there's enough of a difference, but in a smaller UI, it's going to be a little different to try to figure out the difference. But that's kind of one of the caveats that comes with that. So we'll work through that. Let's see here. So just to speak to normalizing, and I know you're aware of this, but just for anybody that might watch this later, if I go to grayscale here, hold on here. Okay, there we go. So when I talk about normalizing, I'm referring to just making sure that that value works equally in grayscale. So you can see how if we go down each step, each column, they feel in grayscale like they're almost the same. They're not going to be perfect. Reds skew a little darker here, just because of wanting to make sure that they are differentiated more so than the orange when necessary. But overall, they're pretty normalized, and I think that'll help with our use. So I'll just put that away for now.
Yeah, and I think that it's very subjective, right? So even if you're working with the numbers and the color contrasts are the same values, which is good from purely and they're valid from a purely accessibility standpoint, and you can see they're all 451 or above, and so that's good. Or on the other end as well, and the other surface. But at the end of the day, it's always very subjective in how people react to colors. So what I would say is that so the exercise, like for example, when you were showing those 4 examples of what an alert could look like error, warning, success, and info. I don't know if you found it in the older issues, but I actually did this exercise of, okay, so what if we could have this color palette that passed everything and all accessibility standards? And there was, it doesn't look like right off the bat, it doesn't look very as appealing as the more vibrant ones, of course. But at the same time, there was a lot of pushback from most people on the team at the time. So I'm curious to see how that goes this time around. Maybe people are already a bit used to the fact. So historically, we were using initially the Bootstrap color palette, and then along the way, it somehow got messed up, and we were using too many colors at the same time, and different colors for the same meanings. We had many different versions of what would be a red, a more pinkish red, a lot of those things. And so when I did that work and introduced this more, you could call it a bit more cohesive and more toned down palette, there was some pushback to make it a bit darker and to make it pass or the 451, and that's why we relied on the 3-1 to still keep it vibrant. And for those 2 specific cases, like the orange and the green, the purple we don't use a lot in the app today, but those 2 for success information and communicating success or communicating warning states, it was very difficult to get them right and to get them to pass certain accessibility values while keeping them vibrant. So I'm curious to see how people react to that. My initial concern is, or my main concern basically is the differentiation that you were saying between the oranges and the reds, because I believe context is very important, but it kind of loses a bit of its meaning when it's so close as we're seeing it here, I think.
And I think we'll have to test and bear that out. I did approach this in a sense of we want to pass, and doing that requires the 451, and so that's where that is. That's kind of why I've anchored there, is just so that it's like a guarantee, like we are accessible in our color, where there aren't any caveats in how it's used. So I think we can test that out. The other advantage that may or may not be, if and as we go through accessibility testing and whatnot, we do still, because of the way the palette's normalized, we do still have other hue, or other steps in that hue that we can leverage to maybe differentiate more. But I do want to try out of the gate to like satisfy the 451. Otherwise,
no,
it's,
I think that's great, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing here, because as I said, when I tried to do it back then, there was some pushback, and I thought, okay, let's just at least get the hues right and get a good scale at first, and then we can iterate on it. I'm really happy that we're iterating. But like for the oranges, would it work if we change the hue slightly to make it a bit more yellow and instead of red?
So that's a great question. If we start to go more yellow, you have to darken it where it becomes kind of a mustard brown. And so that's why I've skewed with a little more red in the orange, in order that it stays vibrant and not kind of a brown across the board.
Yeah, that's the goal.
And so that is definitely something that was a takeaway we can explore. You could see for DataViz, here's an option for DataViz that skews more towards the, a little more yellow, less of the red in there. And you'll notice how it gets, this one works pretty good. It's kind of an orange gold. However, if we wanted to do like the 451, we'd be looking at, just turn these values back on here. We'd be looking at somewhere between these two steps to actually achieve that, which at that point, I don't know how orange it feels, but I could explore somewhere between the DataViz orange and the UI orange, in that regard. The other consideration why this skews a little more red in the UI is that I'm wanting to separate it from DataViz so that we have that separate palette. So like in our color exploration, taking a look at like where do our current items align today, and you can kind of see the bell curve where items will really pass. Yellows are obviously, as notoriously difficult. And so there's kind of this medium, where it starts to get kind of more of a greenish yellow and skews then more brown. So we could definitely
I'd love to see some experiments with making it a bit more yellow. Like I think if it's not as appealing, like for example, this orange for data visualization that you're showing here is not as appealing as the other orange for UI. But I think it would communicate better the difference between orange and red. Warning and
so consider that as a trade-off, right? Like our vibrancy of it versus
because I'm imagining like a case. I'm not remembering one right off the bat, but if you have
pipelines is a good case.
Oh yeah, in pipelines we have that differentiation. But what I'm saying is, for example, if you have two actions, like one is a destructive action, the other you must be you like take care before you activate this, and they're in the same context, not necessarily next to each other. It doesn't communicate, I think, very well that difference. And you were going down to that's I think my main concern with the UI. Now that you were talking about the data viz, if you scroll a bit down, so in that case for the orange, and I guess for the other values as well, if I wanted to use an orange color for text in a lighter background, which one would I use?
So that's a great question for DataViz. These are mainly for like the actual graphical objects, not text, because text has the other requirement. But if you had to use one of these values for text, then I would, I would skew towards the ones that actually meet the 451 and
Okay.
rely on the ones that are the 500, so 600 values. And I would use the 400 the 500 values for the UI elements.
Yeah.
So that's where, with the data viz, we could step it up just to make sure.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
But
Also
generally,
because
yeah,
it's
go ahead.
usually associated with some color chips. Like if it's a chart's legend, for example,
Yeah.
you would get, oh, there you go.
Yeah, exactly. So here's, two examples using that palette. And, obviously like text we would keep text with the normal UI guidelines, but then anything that is specific to the data viz, like the chips or the actual display of the data, visualization of it, we would use the palette for.
And do you think in this case, for data viz, since we're using this mostly for um, colored objects that are not very small, they're quite large, and they're not interacting with text, so they're not behind text or over text. Do you think they need to be so toned down, or could they be more vibrant, and do we still need to care as much about the contrast ratios?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they still have to pass, and like in that regard, like scale doesn't necessarily matter. So a 3.1 is still where we want to be at for passing, and so that's the kind of the rule. The more saturation we end up with, the darker it's going to have to be in order to satisfy that. So,
right. But I thought so I know that the WCAG contrast guidelines, they recently started mentioning not only text contrast, but also some other elements. I think they're already including those. But I wasn't sure if they would also include these, just these large things, basically these large areas that don't interact with text.
Yeah, definitely. They do. Yeah. In fact, there's a few examples of charts I linked to it in the data viz issue. So it's basically, UI components and graphical objects must have that 3-1 against adjacent colors. And so, and that's where we use other separators to help, separate that. But they do have some examples in here where, let's see here.
Yeah, you can see it, that one.
Yeah. So, this one, you can read through these, but
it makes sense. I think
when there's text like there as an alternate, then the contrast ratio can be essentially secondary because the text is still communicating the data. But obviously you could see like these are right there within that. And obviously, these don't even contrast in there. And so that's where a lot of what we're doing is where there are no data points specifically related to these. So the color is what helps indicate the difference. And I think here's another example here. They've got, let's see. Yeah, so this one is a fail because of, it passes for color, but it fails because you can't discern the edges, so they don't contrast against each other. However, like this one's not applicable because the values actually point directly to the items. And then this one's a pass because it essentially does both, where there's visual separators between the colors pass in the background.
Okay.
So,
but in this case, it passes because of the borders, right? Because that yellow,
yes,
the fill yellow,
Yep,
it probably
exactly.
doesn't pass, but the border passes.
Exactly. And so that's, yeah, you're exactly right. So the
So
white,
wouldn't that be a way for us to increase the vibrance of those colors?
it
And
yep,
yeah.
it is. And that's actually what I have in, let's see here. Let's go back to exploration here. So some of the executions I've done, I actually explore, like using the passing
Right.
value as the border, and then using other items as the spacers. So
Mm-hmm.
I think in the database issue itself, there is a section on visual separators. Yeah, so using, different separators or
Mm-hmm.
values to actually help
Yeah.
separate those. So, in these cases, you're talking about vibrance. Well, one of the things we could do is, here I've used the passing value for the border, but keeping more of a transparent inside just
Mm.
for the sake of for that passing. But we could also say, hey, let's come over here, and I'll use the 400 value for the border, because I know that passes on the white surface.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe the fill, I actually just want to use something like I guess that's the value, but we can use something along these lines or whatever to kind of
Oh wow, yeah, yeah.
make that
That's,
pop a
I
little
mean,
more, depending on the on the use case. But
yeah, yeah,
uh, the other consideration with data is making sure that these colors uh, work against or with each other, or don't conflict, where they
correct.
look too similar. And so that's
Mm-hmm.
part of the reason for
Yeah.
where they're at as well.
I think this small exercise that you were doing, not necessarily with these colors, perhaps
Mhm.
these are too vibrant, but just making them a bit more vibrant, I think would be less of um, a challenge for people to get used to. I think the initial, of course, and we can test this easily, but my gut reaction personally is that the colors were too muted and too muddy, and yeah, and thinking about also the visual culture that users have of other apps, that they use, where they use more vibrant colors that perhaps they don't pass the contrast guidelines, but
Mhm.
people find them appealing. And then if they come to GitLab, they're going to see they would see these muddy colors that are not very attractive. I think a middle term here, if we could use the border for that. Yeah, like something that you're doing like there,
Mhm.
where it's a bit dark, not that vibrant, but it's still more attractive than what was there
Yep.
before. I think this is a good exercise.
Yeah. So I mean, that's all great points. All great points. I think there's some fluidity in here, and as you can see,
Mm-hmm.
there's some
Yeah.
pretty vibrant values in here.
Mm-hmm.
But I really want to make sure that first and foremost, like it's 100% accessible. I think I had some examples. Let's see, I've got some resources in here. This is like a really long issue. Let's see here. Yeah. All right. So I think back to the tool, color box is what I had been
Color
using.
box, yeah, this
Right.
one
And
is
so I'm able to plug in like some key values, like our key hex values
right.
or whatever. And then based off of that, with the number of steps, et cetera, come up with that. And then I was gonna, let's see here. IBM has like they're kind of one of the places that I really look to just based on their exploration. And they had kind of these 6 steps. Uh, and I guess to that end, I should walk through those steps for Dataviz just to kind of explain how I got to where I'm at.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
First and foremost is to say, okay, like let's take an audit of what we have today. All right. So we know we've got UI, neutrals, and themes. those all have very specific use cases and applications. So we don't want to use those, right? So we're not going to be selective in there. Contrary to that, we don't have like a broad palette that extends beyond those. So we can't just say, oh, here's another set of values, hues that we're not using, let's use those. So it's completely additive at this point. And knowing that we have specific use cases for UI, that's where the exploration was to like, let's find some gaps in our current sequence and leverage those where, okay, brand, brand, we're using this, UI, we've got these, themes, we've got these, okay, that leaves some gaps for data. And that's where, you know, come in and say, okay, for data, we can skew this a little more vibrant for the blue, maybe a little more magenta, you know, a little more gold, the green, a little more lime, etc. So that's where that comes
makes
into
perfect
play.
sense.
And in that regard, you know, we end up with a palette that is, it's not conflicting with existing. So that's why some of these might look less saturated or just slightly different. So then once you level in on that, okay, here's the relative hue that we're going to use. At that point, it's okay, let's pick the actual hue and then establish the scale. Okay, so we know 3.1 or 3-to-1 ratio at the 500 values. So let's establish what those are and then build off from there. So then you build off from there. And then after that, you say, well, we need to really normalize these so that you can, once again, choose, correct values across each hue, but you know that they're going to be able to be applied in a consistent fashion. So you go to front end and you could say, any of these, 500 values you can use for the border, any of X values you can use on this. And then, in the future, when we actually have more, hopefully like a dark theme in GitLab, we'd be able to say, okay, here's the set you use for the dark surface, the dark UI, here's for the light UI. So a lot of those, so as you start to narrow in like the constraints, the range of color that you can use starts to get pretty limited based on, like I said, the fact that we've already got UI
and that's good.
So,
those constraints are in this world of color. If you don't have those constraints, you could be here forever, lost, like mixing colors, and you would never know what is right.
Yeah. And then lastly, with the hues is the actual, I'm blanking right now, as far as just color simulation and actual color blindness. So not only do you have all those other factors, but also making sure that the hues that you pick are going to work with each other and actually stand out. So, just a cycle through here, you can see how green and orange tend to skew the same. Aqua and magenta, here we have good separation. Here, green and orange, and again, aqua magenta. So starting to make sure that they work together under these different
and that also factors into the priority of usage, right? So if you only need to use one color for the chart, like use this first. If you need to use two colors, use these, because we know that these stand out the most when you're doing when you're dealing with color blindness. So that's a very good.
Exactly. And then based on that, actually creating some color sequencing.
Exactly.
So, this is also based on a lot of work that IBM has done, but choosing a pattern that is consistent for choosing, and in this case, it's, it's the reverse chevron skipping pattern. So we're going from a 500 value of green to a 600 value of magenta, back to a 500 value of the blue, to et cetera, and and so on. And that way, that's actually where I arrived at like this sequence here, so that when we use these, in these circumstances, we actually end up with
different,
an alternating pattern where, these they're close, but they have enough of a lightness difference, and the sequence bolsters that. So those are kind of some of the the parameters that working with
I love that. I love
that.
that.
So
That's very good. That's also like I mean, it's really good that we have this ability to simulate how people would see it, because this is like an amazing outcome to see all of that.
And I will say, I'll pop back up into a sketch here. You know, in some of the exploration, I don't know that it's that, how do you say, less appealing, right? So, you know, here's today. You know, we have this this bar chart. I'll scroll down. Here's, you know, this area chart. You know, this tends to get kind of muddy, and you get some kind of weird colors in here. You know, if we switch back over, let me go back to exploration. You know, this is not, I would say, all that less appealing, if that makes sense. And I'd say, you know, even the server response time, like this one is actually more appealing, because you don't get that muddy overlay. So I think there's going to be some good wins in there, that you know, as you're viewing the data, it's not going to feel yuck or have that kind of a tone down approach. In some cases, it could actually
I think in this case, for the server response times, the colors might be blending better with the transparency, and that wasn't the case of the example that you showed in Sketch. For the column charts, I think the other one looks more, at least to me personally, it looks more appealing. So yeah, I think the exercise that you were doing of trying to increase the vibrance a little bit by choosing other values, it was interesting.
Yeah, and it'll depend on the use case, right? Like if we need these to show through, you know, the different data lines, then that's obviously the, you know, the more transparency, the less of the vibrance is going to be there. But if that's not the case, then you know, then we do have the opportunity to potentially, you know, go more of this route. So where we could actually, I don't know which one that actually would overlay, but we'll just pretend it's that one for now. But anyway, yeah, we, you know, where we could do that. And the other thing that we can explore is also just different blend modes with CSS. So we could use the more vibrant and use like a blend mode. We could also have keep these vibrant, but then instead of the data lines being behind, make them actually like a transparent black on top. So we can keep the vibrance in the bar, but actually, you know, just change the z-index of a few things, and I think we would have some wins there too. So I think we can be pretty creative in that. I think the main thing is like establishing like a palette that we know works mathematically. It works from accessibility. It works from color blindness.
For sure.
It works when we normalize it. So yeah, so that's where we're.
Yeah, in that regards, I don't have any reservations about what you created here for the data visualization. It was only like which tones do you choose to apply to the charts themselves. But I think the palette itself is amazing. The last thing I wanted to touch on was yeah, I see that you have the warm and cool neutral. I'm not going to touch a lot on those. I think it's a good exercise, and let's see later how we can apply it. I wanted to focus on, we talked, it's basically three things that I have some concerns in feedback. Like the first one we already talked about is the UI orange not being too different from the red. So that we already touched on. The other thing was the usage of the data visualization palette. And then the third one is so can you go back to that example where you have the UI palette that you arrived on compared to, or right next to the previous one or the current one that we have implemented?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's that one. Yeah, exactly. So
And this is
Hmm.
the caveat that some of these values have been updated
Okay.
since, but since the issue was created, but like this was initial exploration. But anyways, that
Yeah.
aside, it follows the same thinking.
So I wanted to touch on what you explained in the beginning of how the progression was made different between the two.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically two different approaches. So and so basically what I did was, and you can see that very clearly on the green palette, is uh, the the tones closer to the edges. I increased the saturation
Mm-hmm.
so that they would have more vibrance and would be more appealing and less, uh, and yeah, just more vibrant. And also, so I had to pair the vibrancy, and because if you try to do that linearly, you would get just some more muddy
Yep.
tones.
Yep.
And also when you have very, and you know this probably better than I do, when you have the like very dark colors, you can effectively increase the saturation much more than you would with other
Mm-hmm.
colors, and they start to be more appealing,
Yep.
because when you reach that darkness, the color doesn't shine so much, right? um, and so it was two things that I had to balance. It was the saturation, because I knew if I did it linearly, I would get more desaturated tones than usual. And also the brightness. So you mentioned this scale is not linear. I don't know exactly what kind of scale I use, but instead of being linear, it's a bit more of a curve.
Mm-hmm.
It was because of testing how those outer values, so the lightest one and the darkest one, would function as background colors.
Mm-hmm.
So my perception of the color palette, regardless of the current approach that we have implemented or the one that you are working on and eventually will propose, I think that the colors closer to the center will help us pick the like text colors and icon colors for different backgrounds. So for light backgrounds or dark backgrounds, you would choose for text and icons
Mm-hmm.
colors that are closer to the middle. And for backgrounds, you would choose the colors that are um, far away from the
Yeah.
center, right? So yeah, so this is my rationale, and that's what I wanted to share with you. And
Yep.
what I wanted to hear from you is how would and when you were showing that diagram that has one side that is dark and the other side is light,
Yeah.
how did you test those colors in reverse? So for example, if we had a dark mode and you wanted to use a very like a green background,
Mm-hmm.
probably wouldn't use in the dark mode, you wouldn't use the lightest green. You would probably go to the other side of the spectrum and use a darker tone. So how do you
Mm-hmm.
see those, like the middle values, used in conjunction with the values that are on the outer edges?
Yeah, that's a great question. For one, I'll say in here, these values I have dark or lightened the at least the lighter scale up quite a bit,
Mm.
so that there is more contrast between the ends, uh,
Okay, cool.
and so and then also I guess in here you can see that these are pretty saturated, probably more so than current. Towards the darker end. That was one of my goals as well. Like
Yeah, yeah,
even
I
here,
think you're probably right. Yeah,
yeah,
it looks that way from here. Yeah.
yeah, they're more saturated. But I did lighten these up so that the distance between each step was a little greater. So yes, back to that. I'll just pull this up quick. You can see that what we could do is again normalize that and say, hey, if you're going to be using this 500 value, you can overlay that on the 50 value and you always know that it's going to pass. And
Yeah,
so that's kind of the thinking there.
yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly it.
And so we can also apply those rules to that. And so that was one of those items. Going the other route, just based on UI you know, we'll have to, I guess we'll have to explore a little more of the impact of that, because, you know, obviously going from 500 to 950 is low. But we might be able to, you know, obviously in a dark UI, we can step
Yeah.
that up a little bit and change that. And
Yeah, no,
that'll
that
be
looks
some
amazing.
testing, but we'd still be able to normalize it and say, okay,
Exactly.
in a dark UI, always use 300 on 950 or
Yes.
200 on 900. So once again, that's where like the normalizing really does, I guess help. I was going to just put in really quick here. I took a screenshot based on our current, you know, our current items, and you could see that. Let me just.
Oh, it looks very close.
Yeah, I'm gonna crop this. Hold on a second here, just so I can get that edge. Let's see, enter. Okay, so yeah, you can see the green, you know, is very close. Let's see, oops, I'm moving the wrong thing here. Blue, the blue is definitely darker, but that's part of that normalizing. Orange.
Yeah.
Also at the light end, like, you know, differentiating these is very difficult. So I wanted to have a little more saturation in there, a little more depth, so that we could effectively differentiate those more.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair.
Yeah. So again, it's, you know, a lot of it was about the normalizing. So if I, you know, if I go over to this again.
Yeah, for the grayscale. Yeah.
It's you know, here it's hard to be consistent with like always pick a 500 over a certain one, and so I really wanted to make sure that we could do that. But yeah, and then obviously you know, respect that with you know, the work that you've done as far as balancing those out. So
yeah, no, for sure. And I think back to what I said at the beginning, I think the biggest you know, besides the red and orange difference, I think the biggest struggle is possibly to win the hearts and minds of designers and GitLabbers about having the 500 values or the values that we would use the most be a bit more toned down. So you know, like right now we have this. I don't even think it's in pajamas. Unfortunately, I don't think we added it yet. But we have this rule of it's okay to only pass the contrast guidelines, even if it's small text. We use the guidelines for large text, right? So we have it's the 3-1 thing. And so the colors get more vibrant, and everyone jumped on board and said, "Oh yeah, that looks great. It's a good iteration on what we had before."
Yeah.
So I think the challenge now is to win over. I mean, you win me over because I as a designer and having worked through this, I know how hard it is to get to this place where you can effectively have a palette that passes everything and is perfect from an accessibility standpoint. But it's and rationally, I'm in love with it. Now it comes the more emotional and more visual side that people might. But yeah, I'll back you up on that if necessary.
Yeah, well, no, I appreciate that, and to me, you know, as a designer, like first and foremost, that's like the toughest part about it is like, hey, I want this to really have like this vibrancy, but then on the other side of things, understanding like, you know, the product is used globally. It is
to fix the problems.
Yeah, we're using this for all kinds of human eyes and hands and like, you know, and so I really wanted to to take a step back and be like, how can we make this as universally usable as possible, like first and foremost, and then from there, like, let's push like how much, you know, saturation can we get out of this, while staying within those constraints. So I do feel that kind of that pull, and
more
I think
towards the accessibility side.
Yeah, it's kind of both, right? It's
Yeah,
like
it's a
use
balance, but
accessibility
yeah.
as the positive constraint, but then within that constraint,
Yeah,
how vibrant can we make this within that constraint? And I
yeah,
think that, you know, in looking at kind of industry wide, like where IBM has landed, I'm going to see if I can find that link really quick here, but uh, I don't know if I have theirs in here or in their design systems, but you know, seeing where some of the, you know, kind of the
yeah, the
design
carver.
leaders right now for UI are at, I think that uh, that we're following in some really good footsteps, and I think it's you know,
Hmm.
pretty helpful. If they've got their where they put their colors. Anyway, I won't take up our
Perhaps
time here, but
guidelines or.
yeah, let's see, color. There we go. Right. So you can see, you know, on their notes about accessibility, and they've got like, you know, they've got their range, and then hey, this
Mhm.
is not accessible, etc. So I think that there's a pretty good balance. They actually have quite a bit more
How
in the
do they
way
solve
of.
the orange problem?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me see if I can. They have so many different uh, sites on their color. So I'm just let's see here if I've where I've saved it. 'Cause like I said, they've got dozens of places where I've seen this. Hold on, let me just see if I've referenced it in any of
No, but
these
if you don't find it,
papers. But
it's okay. But I was just wondering.
yeah,
Um,
I'll find it because there's a place where they actually have some really good um, references to their charts. I don't know that I included that in one of these articles, but uh,
it's the first link there, no? Or is that just for
that's
data viz?
that was for their data viz, but they might have some screenshots. So yeah, so here's kind of
Oh, there you
a screenshot of their palette, and you know I'm sure they have different rules. Like you could see, you know, if we look at the orange 50,
go. Yeah, it's what you
that
were saying. Yeah,
it starts to get, you know,
yeah,
in that.
muddy. Yeah.
And so that's where, you know, we'll have to balance, and their red gets a little more candy, like a little more magenta than,
Mm-hmm.
and so, you know, that might be another option is, hey, let's leave orange where it's at, but let's maybe add some more magenta to the red
Perhaps.
and, and move that way. Then we, you know, we start to get into more of uh, the, the data viz where we're starting to cross into that place, but I think it could still be different. So, you know, make more
Right.
of a cherry red. So I think we have a little bit of room to do that, and maybe, you know, maybe the orange is not the one to move, but maybe we come in
Maybe.
here and maybe the red is actually, you know, the one that, you know, maybe I'll just break this for a second, but you know, maybe this one is where we actually say, well, you know what, we're actually going to skew it a little more,
Yeah.
you know, this
That's the kind of color that we had before I did the work on the colors. That's
way.
the one we had for
Yeah.
danger, and one of the reasons. So this is completely open for iteration, of course, is to make it more this kind of hue was to align it with our brand and with our
100%
red.
agree. Yeah.
Um, because I thought that it looked very different. Like we had a cherry, like you were saying, more cherry, more magenta red, and then you had the red in the logo, and that we use a
Mm-hmm.
lot in the marketing side, and it looked so different. It looked like separate things,
Yeah.
but um, but yeah, that's food for thought. One last thing I wanted to, at least from my side, uh, to see the experiment. Can you quickly swap the backgrounds, the dark with the light one?
For
Yeah, just swapping, like putting the dark background on the right side and the light one on the left.
got it. How about I just do this quick? Let's
Sure.
do this. I will get rid of that. We'll just do
Or maybe, yeah, that's easier.
yeah. Oh, still got a little layer there. And over here, let's make this all.
Because this will, like, this effectively shows how a light theme would look versus a dark theme, right? And I'm always in that mode of immediately thinking, how can I use this palette, right? And for me, my perception, and I'd like to hear your thoughts as well, is like, as I said before, like maybe the middle values I would use for text and icons, and like in this and maybe use some darker tones, like if it's a hover or active or selected. Maybe for a background, I would use the darker ones, but maybe here in the light one, it's the other way around. Like, so maybe backgrounds, I would use the lighter tones. And for things that I want to stand out more, I would use the darker tones.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. And yeah, I would 100% subscribe to that, where like we do today, you know, a button on hover gets darker, but maybe in a you know, in a converse way. That way we can start with kind of the vibrance of the 400, you know, on a button. As you hover, it gets lighter. So in a dark mode, the lightness is coming more towards you, and et cetera. Yeah. I would totally subscribe to that.
Yeah, and I was interested in seeing how the dark, specifically in this case, how the dark colors worked with the black, the darker background, the black or dark gray background, and yeah, the 950 values, they're tough. They're not easy, and to be honest, I don't know. Like from when I was thinking about the initial color palette, I just had them there, but I don't know exactly when they would be used.
I wouldn't use them on dark.
No,
so.
right, exactly. But even on light, it's such a, it reaches a point that you can't differentiate the colors anymore.
Unless it's a large space,
Exactly. And here we're seeing these larger blocks, these color chips, but we don't have anything like that on GitLab. So I don't know when they would be used, but that's the problem with the color palette, is also deciding. And I saw that on the issue, how many tones you would have, like 9, 10, 11, how much is too many?
Yeah. And today I stuck with exactly that what we have, so that as MVC, all we have to do is update the variables. Like, we don't have to worry about anything beyond that. Like today for the UI palette, we could just easily update the variables, test it out, and you know, and go from there. So that we don't have to worry about that. And in the future, we could, you know, go from there. I find that it's good to have a couple steps in there, so that just for different focus states, different hover states. So
yeah, interestingly here, the line that points to the arrow that points to the left versus the arrow that points to the right, you have more tones on the right than on the left.
Because we have 11 in the set.
Yeah. So I mean, if we do a quick search on the code base, and we find that today we're not using the 950 value, for example, maybe we can consider removing it, right?
The other thing though is if, let's say in a dark UI, we want to have, when you talk about themes, well, I guess obviously we have these themes, so we can leverage that. But so maybe that, I'll just stop there. I don't know that that's actually even necessary, because we have the darker value for the themes already. So that's a whole nother aside. So yeah, it's quite possible we don't even need those.
Yeah, I'm seeing, I just searched our code base, and we're only using, I didn't see the GitLab UI, but in the actual product today, we're only using the 950 value for a gray. Yeah, it's not no chromatic colors are being used with the 950 value. So I mean, we don't have to keep something just for the sake of keeping it. And I think you, like what you have done here, it's very good, and we already have this value if we want to come back to it. But if you think like, okay, the way we present this and we implement this, we don't need this value now, maybe we can remove it.
Yeah, I think that's 100% viable. So, yep. Yeah, I think that's good. And on that note, you'll notice, speaking of like the ends of the values, I did add a 0 value to the grays, and the reason for that is because I also wanted neutrals to be normalized with the rest of the UI palette, so that a 500 gray has the same contrast ratio as a 500 in one of the hues. And so, but doing that means that the 50 value is a bit darker than I want for like our surfaces. So in this regard, I added the 0 values to account for surfaces. So on either end, you would use the 0 value or the 950 value for our surfaces. So the
Right,
FA, FA, and the 1F, 1F, so that we have those in the neutrals, which I think is has a lot of value, because just that slight nuance I think is critical. So if we, even if we shortened up the UI palette to be 50 to 900, I think that's a nice clean approach. What I also like about that is that when we say dark theme, light theme, there's like a clear split, where like if you're on a dark theme, you use the 400 to 50 values, or 50 to 400. If you're on a light UI, you use 500 to 900. So that creates a nice even split.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed in dark themes, however, is that they don't, like in GitLab today, we have mostly a white background, and then you use, for other large surfaces, for secondary content, you use the lightest possible gray. And I think that makes sense. But if you try to do it like with a very, just basically flip it over and do it the inverse, you would get a black background, right? And I don't know. So if some dark themes that I've been seeing, they have they either like just have one version of the dark theme, but I've seen some apps and some websites that have two versions. They have the dark, and then they have the black, right? And the dark, it uses the like a dark gray, as we're seeing here in this artboard, that only has like a little bit of light, and it's not black. And then they also have the black, which is really, really black, because the black, it's very dark, right? And so dark themes, they tend to use a not so dark color for the backgrounds.
Yeah, and that's why I've used the 1F and the FA for our surfaces, just as kind of that contrast, baseline. And then I would say that if we went that way, we make that an accessibility feature for like a high contrast mode, that we can do all the way white and all the way black, and the palette can remain, because we know that it passes regardless, right? So that's what's kind of a benefit to that.
Yeah.
So next steps, for me, I would really like to implement the data viz palette and get some of those variables out there to test, because we just don't have that today at all. We're kind of picking and choosing from current variables based, I think pulling from UI and themes today. So I think it would be great to have that dedicated data viz palette where, some of the work that's happening now with the area charts and bar charts and whatnot could start to leverage that, and we could really put it through its paces. Then we'll actually have those values or those variables where we could, go in and tweak a variable here and there as needed. But at least we have something to start running with. So that's how I'd like to, to move forward with data viz. Neutrals is a little different, because there's some different mapping where there's a shift there. So today, tokens look like this. In order to have them look similar tomorrow, we would have to come in and kind of per component say, okay, it's fill 100 now, it's or fill 200 now, it's fill 100. A little bit of,
I see the
we
difference.
can still create like the exact same feel. It's just we have to adjust those values. But then again, it there's a benefit because we're normalizing things and saying like, hey, 500 values, you know, as a developer, as a designer, if you use a 500 value, it's going to pass on FA, period. And you can always do 2 steps darker for the hover state or the border or whatever. So we can really start to bake in some of those rules. So I think it'd be interesting to test out this palette further, you know, in a separate MR and see how quickly we can adjust some of the components, at least in GitLab UI, to leverage something like that.
And so if we, going back to the, to what we were talking about, the 950 value for colors, for chromatic values. So if we decided to remove those, right?
Yeah.
We wouldn't need to introduce, like you would still have all of the colors of the neutral except the last one, right? But you wanted to keep that one for the backgrounds, right? For the big
Yeah,
circle.
I would keep our 950.
Right. Okay. I see.
Yeah, I would keep, so the neutrals, I think those should span further just because we are using those for type and surfaces, right? So reserve those end caps for that, but obviously we don't have the similar need.
Yeah, let's think about this quickly in the different way. So what if, because I'm looking at the black, right? And the black, in theory, there's no reason, like no strong reason why you would use today a black over the 950 value, right? So what if, let me see. Exactly. So what if you, removed the black, the 950 value of the neutral would be our new black, right? And so when you change themes from the light theme to the dark theme, the backgrounds usually are white in the light theme, but then in the dark theme, it would be just switching to our black, right? So our darkest color would be the 950 and not black.
I think in that regard, I still want to leverage pure black for like a high contrast or accessibility mode in the future. Just to have that in the back pocket. However, what you could do is keep black as a variable, but assign it the 950. And then in a high contrast mode, you just change the variable of black. You override that. So you know what I mean? You just have like
right. Okay.
So we could do that. So that black essentially consumes the 950 variable. And then if you do an excessive, high contrast mode, in the same way with Bootstrap, you just overwrite that variable where now high contrast mode, like it becomes pure black. So I think that that would be one way to do it, but we could clearly state that like, hey, black is 950. We still keep the 950, but
yeah, I was just trying to avoid having the 0 value for the neutrals. Not that we don't need it. I think we do, but yeah, it's just having the naming and the number of values consistent between chromatic and neutral. But it's not easy.
Yeah, it's, and even when you talk about themes, themes are still using 11. The data viz is using the 11 with obviously the middle has the crossover, which, by the way, I explored doing that for the UI, trying to have the 500 value meet the contrast on both, but it was just not really possible. They're just too far apart.
Right.
So
yes, when I updated you were mentioning how can we go about updating, for example, the neutrals. Yeah, I think it's reasonable to do it in one go, even in the app today. I remember when I was updating it in the beginning, I had like one first version of the neutrals, and then I had to add the 50 value. So in the beginning, I
Mm-hmm.
only had 100 to
Okay.
900. I didn't have the 950 or the 50 values at the edges. And so when the second version came out and I added those, basically I had to go through almost everything, or at least where we were using the values, and see, okay, what makes sense here. And it was just changing and looking at one example, changing that, seeing how it looked. Okay, and now I know that all 200 values are 100, and they will also always
Mm-hmm.
look good everywhere. So I think that's feasible.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was thinking about the themes. Um, if it would make sense to get rid of the dark and light variations and just have one red, one blue, because they're more like muted red and active red, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Although and I had that thought too, but when I actually looked at how they're used in the product, like it's not like we're swapping like dark red 500 for light red 500.
right. Yeah, they're different, right?
Yeah, they are like they're picking and choosing like different across that. So we'd have to look at that. But per the data that was pulled on that, like those are like themes are like they're not common like where somebody goes in and changes it from the default. It's almost rarely to not used at all. So
Yeah.
I think that would be a relatively low impact. We'd have to look at a few of them and just see. But
Yeah, I would love if we could remove them and just have one like blue, green, and red that would work with both a light UI and a dark UI.
yeah, I 100% I agree on that. So I think
Yeah.
we could take that offline
Mm.
as well. And when I say offline, that's like old school being in an office talk,
No,
right?
no,
It
I,
just
yeah,
means
no, I
like
understand.
outside of this meeting, we're always online. So yeah, going back to the neutrals, I still think it'd be really interesting to have a 0 and a 950 value, where we always
Mhm.
said like those are surfaces, like
Right.
those are like what we use for the surface, and since we don't have those in the other values, like it makes sense, like we just have that kind of dedicated. Uh, you always know like, oh, if I see a gray 0, I know that that's a surface, that's a background. If I
Mm.
see a gray 950, I know that that's how that's being used. So we can really start to like solidify those values. If I see a 500, I always know like, okay, that's passing on white. If I see in a dark theme a 400, I know that's passing on on the on the converse in a dark UI,
Mm.
which I'm now noticing like in my 400 values here. I would have to change these a little bit to actually get the neutrals to pass. Looks like I haven't edited the values for
Mm.
the warm grays, but this would have to lighten up just a little bit to have a little more contrast on the on a dark UI, so that the 400 value would work in the neutrals. But anyway, that can be a small tweak, but yeah. So testing those would be great. I think as far as the UI color palette, I want to do some more exploration and testing, because we're not, one of our rules, right, is not to use color alone for meaning. And
Mhm.
so because of that, if we have a warning, a danger, we know that there should be something else corresponding to that, whether it's
Mhm.
iconography or text that
Right.
helps provide that meaning. And so
Right.
that's why I'm less worried about the color there, but we can explore that.
I agree. Yeah.
Another random thought. I know you had mentioned brand. That's probably another reason why I just in the back of my mind kept this orange a little more on the red side instead of going
Mhm.
more of the gold, is just to keep it more in line with that. But
Mhm.
considering that we actually do have that the brand light orange, I think that I could try to skew it more towards a mustard
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
see
I
where we
love
net
mustard.
out. What's that?
I love mustard.
Like right now it's a bit of a spicy mustard. Like we
Exactly.
can go a little
Oh,
more
yeah.
to a pure yeah. So well, I
Mhm.
can do that as a takeaway before we do anything with these. uh, I do think on a, you can see how these do feel nice and vibrant on a depending on the background. On the dark UI, they actually kind of stand out quite a bit. On the light UI, I think
Yeah, I
They
think
do stand out.
the difference there is when you put them with elements, like with text and icons, for
Yeah.
example. I think that's where you can see, like, if you put them side by side and you try to see the difference,
Hmm.
it's not as much as a difference as with the like info or success.
Yeah.
But yeah, and just the cool and warm neutrals. It was
Hmm.
just what's do you have a specific intention for those, or was it more of a just let me experiment while I'm at it?
Well, it was just, based off of this
Yeah, I
issue.
had that idea, but
Like
yeah, it's
it's 2 years old, but I- it's more in line with that. Just seeing like how would these neutrals work if we wanted to extend them in that way. Uh, and so it's purely an exploration of just seeing, how applicable is it, because our UI right now, if you're using the default, it skews more where like a cool
hmm
neutral would actually, I think, be really nice, because
yeah,
it's gonna, I think some of the points that you made in that issue, as far as just adding a little bit of warmth to it, even though it's the cool gray, but it adds that
yeah,
kind
yeah,
of life to it. It gives it a different
it's true.
quality.
Yeah,
I think that would be like very subtle, but I think
yeah,
it'd be awesome.
yeah,
And that being said, we could also say, you know what, like let's just make the neutrals a little more on the cool side, and just still have one level of neutral, but
yeah.
we skew it more towards the cool. So it's just another exploration and something else to test.
And maybe to ease people in, you could change like a percentage every release.
We just, yeah, we could
So
write a script to do that, right? To just update like the
yeah, just a
variable,
little
like,
bit every release so that they get used to,
yeah.
because it's like if especially for us and other organizations that use GitLab every day, changing the neutrals to a cooler tone in this case, it it will be felt like people maybe at the beginning wouldn't know what changed, but they're like, something changed, like
Yeah.
this is different. Did my monitor change? Um, but I agree. I think it looks more polished if it's a little bit of a hue in there, a little
Yeah.
bit of color. It overall it looks more polished and uh, pushes us a little bit away from the bootstrap feeling, right?
Yeah.
That people have when they look at GitLab, and maybe even differentiate us more from GitHub, for example, that
Mhm.
only uses the neutrals, the neutral neutrals.
Yeah. I think that's good, and that's something we can test out too. Because to your point, like, I mean, my monitor changes throughout the day, and obviously, not obviously, but
Mine
in
too.
the evenings, I've got the uh, whatever that night mode is, that makes the
Yeah, they
screen a little
call
more
it the
yellow, and so
color shifts.
yeah, the
Yeah,
color shift, yeah.
shift. Yeah,
So yeah, we'll just do it in the evening so that somebody will be like, "Wow, it's just my color shift."
exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, on neutrals, I definitely want to bear those out a little more. Well, what I'd like to do is just keep neutrals. Well, let me back up a second. I would like to explore implementing this so that it's normalized like the others, but
Mm-hmm.
I think the place to do that, and correct me if I'm wrong, would be in GitLab UI. Is that correct? Because GitLab UI is going to eventually be the styles
Yeah.
that the product inherits, but right now it does not, correct?
Yeah, that's completely right. But I
Okay.
would say, in addition, I would change it in the product right now,
Okay.
because the neutrals have a very small impact. So it would be basically changing the values a little bit. The impact wouldn't be major. We would know that they changed, but probably users wouldn't notice. And it would also be
Okay.
reassigning the existing values. Like, for example, we don't have the 0, right?
Yeah.
So we would have to add that in and change all of the gray 50s to be gray 0, I think,
Yeah.
right? So it
That's
would be
correct.
just doing this shift that you're seeing there,
Mm-hmm.
doing that by hand. And in theory, no, not in theory, like I'm almost positive. that all of the grays that we use today are mapping to the variables file,
Okay.
to just the grays that I designed.
Okay.
So it would be an easy change.
Got it. Got it. And
But we would do them in both places. That's what I'm trying to say.
okay.
Because, or else you would have to wait a long time to see that implemented in the product.
Got it. That makes sense. And I do know, there's no negative impact. Obviously, like if we missed a place, it would just appear darker for a period, so it actually have more contrast. It wouldn't be the other way. So that's how it would end up skewing. But it would be great to be able to jump in and make sure that we change this. And it's not like a 1-to-1 either. So that's where, like, here it goes from border 400 to 200, but here it goes from fill 200 to 100. So it is very manual. To just make sure that we're.
But you just have to change them once. Is what I'm trying to say. Like here, like you can see, like fill 200 goes to 100. It means that all fill 200s will look good at fill 100 because that's the contrast is what was intended, is the same.
Yeah, I think a better way for me to represent this would probably be if I actually, oops, hold on. If I took.
Oh, you're right. Yeah. If you just shifted the whole
thing. I actually, I'll keep the values here just for reference, but if I actually just, do more of this, and then I could actually just, well, let's get that lined up here.
Yeah.
And then I could, I'll keep that, take these and just dupe those for right here. I think, I gotta go over one more.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then anyways, so yeah, essentially.
Yeah.
Just delete that. That'd probably be a better way to represent those, so that we know. Or I think that's. I'll have to mess with that. I'm just doing this on the fly, but
yeah.
We'd have to, because they'll overlap here, but we'll just have to point back to. Actually, I could. I would separate them out. That's what I would do, and just say.
Yeah. Interestingly, in the bottom 300, it's more similar to the top 600.
Yeah, and that's where I was thinking, like, I'd go here.
Yeah.
Here, I think 800 is probably better here.
Yeah.
So that's where, I'd have to, tweak that a little bit and just see where we net out. But in other words, more work to be done to just map those a little better. And understand that, like, if it's 700 today, it's 500 tomorrow, whatever. So anyways, go through the exercise offline there.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Okay. So that's where all that's at.
Yeah. And anything else you'd like my feedback on?
I don't think so at the moment. I will make some updates and update the issue with potentially a little more variance on orange. I'll move forward with the data viz, and maybe if you just want to drop a line or your thoughts, if you have any, on the issue, just to reflect, like, I'll link to the video and all of these as well once I get that uploaded, so that we have that. But I think that's all that comes to mind right now.
Cool. This was great. Yeah, thank you so much, Jeremy, for sharing it. It's amazing work, and it's much better than what it is today. And especially the data viz, it's of course like a brand new thing, and it looks amazing. And I'm hoping to see, as I said, like other people's reaction to it.
Yeah, agreed. We'll definitely work through that. And aside from that, the accessibility piece, I'm working on creating a database of users that we can have test specifically for who are interested in testing specifically for accessibility items, so that we'll have a place to kind of run that by too, just to balance everything out. So
Yeah, yeah. I actually don't know if I don't think that we ask that in the when people are signing up to the first look.
not
Uh,
today. Nope.
that would be interesting to ask. What if they have any kind of visual impairments or
Yeah,
impairments in general?
yeah. There's we have created a separate form for capturing that, and then I'm working on putting the database together so that we can keep that organized. So it's going to be like parallel to first look, but for specifically related to accessibility. So
Awesome, awesome.
yeah,
Well, thank you for working on that. It's really
yeah,
important.
that's great. Well, I appreciate your time. So hope you enjoy some time with your family, and
Yeah, you too. Enjoy the holidays.
yeah, that sounds great. You too. All right, take
Cheers.
care. Bye.
Bye.